you get this unease that's taking place. Where do you read the signal on that? Well, you go back to Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin again makes his address. I think it may have been in St. Petersburg again at that forum. He said, "Oh, we're going to cut defense spending." You go, what? You're going to cut defense spending? Wait a minute, dude. You've got this historic increase. At least since World War II, definitely since the end of the Cold War, in which you've ramped up military spending for this invasion. Now you say suddenly you're going to be able to cut it. And what he's doing is dangling the idea before everybody, oh, well, when we win in Ukraine, I'm going to cut defense spending. That shows you Putin knows that everybody's not completely happy with this.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're talking to Professor Scott Lucas. Scott is Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. And today, I think, is day 1226, so 1226 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation. Yet we're seeing Putin's airstrikes on civilian targets increasing. Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia are hitting more and more defense manufacturing targets and other defense targets elsewhere, whilst Russia's offensive seems to have stalled. And things are getting interesting. Scott, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you so much, Philip. I'm hoping you can help me sort this out in the next 30 minutes.
Well, I think we will put the whole thing in perspective, if not solve it. We'll have to leave that for a few more episodes. But considering recent EU summits call for greater military support for Ukraine and the results that we saw out of the NATO conference saying that Russia was the single biggest threat to NATO. There seems to have been limited progress on new sanctions. And in fact, the United States seems to have eased off on a couple of sanctions. And overnight, there seems to be statements coming out from the US saying that they are restricting the amount of military support that they're putting into Ukraine to preserve domestic stocks. Do you think we need a more unified and robust European stance? What's America doing?
Yeah, what's America doing? It's doing what Donald Trump decides on an hour-by-hour basis. Okay, first, I'm going to do two things here, Phil. First is I'm going to cut through a little bit of Trump administration and Europe here, and let's just say flat out that the Trump administration is an unpredictable, a chaotic actor. Now, there are some, and I've used this phrase again and again, there are some adults in the room in the Trump administration. I think if you look at someone like Keith Kellogg, who is the envoy to Ukraine, he got frustrated a couple of days ago because the Kremlin was falsely saying that it was the U.S. and Ukraine that were holding up negotiations over the invasion. And he clapped back on social quite right and said, no, it's the Russians who are not actually acting in good faith over talks. And of course, he put that out just after Russia had launched a record nightly figure of more than 500 drones and missiles in attacks across Ukraine, many of them on Kyiv. And there are others in terms of like the mid-level that won't make the headlines that are trying to keep some type of U.S. support for Ukraine going. But then you get officials like Marco Rubio, who are the Secretary of State, who are playing all sides. Rubio knows more support needs to go to Ukraine, but he's worried about what Donald Trump is going to do. So he plays all things to all people, including this week, the disgraceful decision. It's not just a question of closing down the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's a question of closing down particular programs, USAID programs, including some of those that are vital in Ukraine. Then you got other Trump administration officials who, frankly, well, let's talk about the purported envoy, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, who has no role there other than to swan around the world pretending he has expertise on this. And in this case, he gets played by the Kremlin. And then Pete Hegseth, who, in my opinion, is an unqualified defense secretary and should go back to being a reality TV commentator. And then you have Trump. And to highlight that unpredictability of Trump, we'll go into the latest news here in the U.S., which is Donald Trump a few days ago. I think he was caught a little bit off guard. He was at the NATO summit and in The Hague, and a journalist comes up and asks, well, what are you going to do to help Ukraine's resistance? And she happens to be a Ukrainian journalist. Now, Trump's asking her, Ukrainian journalist, then what's your husband? Where's your husband? What's he do? Right? And okay, he's on the front line. And then he says, you're a journalist. And it was the first time I've seen Trump either empathize with or feign empathy with a journalist in a very long time. And he's like, oh, we'll have to look at those Patriot missiles. They're 100% effective, right? Overnight, the news that you alluded to is that the Trump administration has suspended delivery of aid that had been authorized by the Biden administration, including Patriot missiles, claiming we have to safeguard American stocks. Now, whether the stocks are actually low or whether once someone's playing silly politics, we'll have to find out. But it just shows this unpredictability of the United States. So on the other side, to get to your question, not just Europe, the entire international community, other countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, not just on Ukraine, but on other issues, they've got to plan without assuming a reliable alliance with the Americans. But that brings me to the second point very quickly, and that is it's the short-term headlines versus the broader situation. And the short-term headlines, and I understand them as, oh my gosh, it's all falling apart, it's in disarray, or on the other hand, it's all come together and there's going to be great success. And you know this from being an expert in the field, that what happens on a daily basis where you get complications, you get confrontations, you get people spinning, it obscures the bigger picture. And where's the bigger picture with Europe? The European Union and its member states, European states within NATO, are ramping up defense production, defense investment. They're ramping that up across all sectors. Are they ramping it up by enough? We know we have the target of 800 billion euros set up by Ursula von der Leyen in March over 5 years. We know we have countries like Germany that have released the debt brake to increase defense investment. We know that there is a vast increase in defense production investment in Western Ukraine in particular. Will all the necessary material reach the front line? Beyond that, will all the air defenses go into place in Ukraine? And how much will Ukraine get to attack Russia behind front lines? Now, those are all open questions, but the broad question is they're open questions that don't get answered in a day, a week, a month. Marathon, not a sprint. That's where we are. That's what people in the know realize. And you got to get beyond the superficial headlines to play this longer in terms of how you analyze it.
Which makes the analysis even more difficult given some of the leaders that we've got around, especially with Donald Trump. But the timing was interesting. You brought out that conversation that Donald Trump had with the journalist at the NATO conference, the Ukrainian journalist, where he hinted that they'd supply more Patriot missiles. But then, as you said, last night, the restrictions seemed to come in. Donald Trump had recently spoken to Vladimir Putin. And they were talking about the Iran-Israeli tensions and then the Ukraine war, and this direct contact between the two has always been something that people have raised a question mark at. And it happened just before we got that change in the sanctions against a couple of Russian banks that were supporting the Russian nuclear industry, I think it was, and then this change in military material support to Ukraine. Is Putin playing Trump, or is this just a coincidence?
Now, Putin's playing Trump, but that's kicking at the open door. You and I know that. I think you need to get into the specifics on that Putin-Trump conversation and put into a couple of contexts. First context, Philip, is the story that came and went maybe a week, 2 weeks ago. Now, it would have been just before the Israeli war. Just before the Israeli war on Iran is that America was diverting air defense missiles down to the Middle East, right? So now why were they diverting it? Well, you can now realize why they were diverting it, because they were expecting Iran might retaliate. So not just to defend Israel, but to defend American personnel and positions. They make that diversion down there. Now, the issue is, are they going to continue to divert missiles down to the Middle East because they know this might not be over? And that's the reality probably behind that headline overnight. We're short on stocks. That is, they're making a priority choice. So, and Putin's going to play on that, right? Oh, Ukraine, that's not your priority. Look, what's happening in the Middle East? You got an issue you got to deal with here. Then you raise the other issue of the sanctions, but you raise the issue of a specific sanction, which is here. And that is that what happened is that Hungary, which is, basically the threat within the EU because of a pro-Kremlin leader, Viktor Orban, we know all of that. Hungary's got a nuclear project which relies on Russian assistance. And the Hungarians this week also blocked the EU's 18th package of sanctions, notably a reduction in the price cap on oil, from Russian oil, from $60 per barrel to $45 per barrel. And they did that for a couple reasons. One is they did it as leverage to try to push back on the sanctions against their nuclear industry. Two, they're doing it because they don't like the EU's timetable, the provision to cut all Russian oil and gas supplies by 2028. Hungary takes a lot of Russian oil and gas. And I have to mention there's a second country that objected as well, which is Slovakia, who also has a pro-Kremlin leader in Robert Fico. So, that's where I'm saying get beyond the Trump-Putin conversation and get where the issues are, because it takes you back to your first question. If Trump's not reliable, we know that. Will Europe get that 18th package of sanctions across? And I think they will. But what they're going to do is they're going to provide some wiggle room on that 2028 target to get rid of all the Russian oil and gas supplies. They're going to give Hungary some assurances over energy supplies from within. There may even be a little bit of an easing on the penalties that Hungary has to pay because it's a nasty country in violation of EU provisions. And then you get the EU putting the cap across without the US joining it, lowering that cap. And then we kick it back to the States. And when we kick it back to the States, we ask the question of, and it won't be answered till Trump's big, not so beautiful bill, until we know the fate of this, but will certain senators, notably Lindsey Graham, who's a friend of Trump, really push the White House that they have to pass a package of sanctions, and that if Trump doesn't agree to it, the Republicans will rebel in Congress and will override the veto.
Well, it's interesting. Lindsey Graham apparently played golf with Donald Trump this weekend. And EU negotiations. We all know that the EU, certain countries will try and extract as much as they possibly can because the EU requires all members to vote. Otherwise, nothing happens, and therefore domestic politics will strongly influence what EU is trying to do from a bloc perspective, which makes it almost an impotent bloc because you can never guarantee getting anything through at any time. But what do you think Lindsey Graham and Donald Trump will have been talking about? And do you think he will have been able to change Trump's view on things?
I have to say that although Lindsey's, as Lindsey tends to do, tries to grab headlines as well by talking about the necessity of getting the sanctions through, that Washington is completely absorbed, has been since last week, by the question of whether Trump's legislation, the massive tax cuts, massive cuts to social programs, huge increase in spending to crack down on immigrants, asylum seekers, whether all of that gets through. Where we are as you and I speak, we're speaking on a Wednesday, is that it passed on a tiebreaker vote in the Senate yesterday, which was J.D. Vance's tiebreaker vote, having passed the House by one vote a couple months ago. But the two pieces of legislation are different. They've got different provisions, so we're not finished yet. You have to reconcile those two versions, which will cause some problems. You can go into a Trump report if you wish, and then you go round and round. So it's not going to. Trump wanted to get it through by July the 4th. He said yesterday for the first time that it might not meet that deadline. Until you get that domestic legislation through, there's not really going to be a refocus by the Congress on Ukraine. And the issue.
Another example of domestic politics, drawing a focus away from support for Ukraine, thereby costing Ukrainian lives.
Yeah, and I'm afraid you and I can talk about the fact it shouldn't be that way, but politics starts at home for many people.
That's the reality.
And the interesting thing here is that because Trump has been relatively silent on Ukraine, he hasn't made any crazed statements recently. It actually works to keep the attention away from that. And of course, the other thing took attention away from Ukraine. I don't think it actually stopped people trying to talk about defending Ukraine, but it took public attention away, was the Israeli-Iran war. And because I think it's not. I don't think that war will revive. I think that ceasefire will hold in a tenuous fashion. But I think we're going to go back to Israel Gaza taking the headlines now, just because the Israelis are just going to just level that place. And Trump is going to say, as he did this morning, everybody's agreed to a ceasefire, when the reality is that no one has agreed to a ceasefire.
Well, it's interesting how the one winner out of this seems to be Vladimir Putin, because he's not got in the headlines. But if you look at the Russian papers today, the headlines are saying things like new car sales in Russia fall by a quarter, Russians struggling to pay off their credit card debts, wage arrears have tripled. June was the most alarming month for the manufacturing industry in 3 years. Do you think we're seeing Russia on the cusp of a collapsing economy? And increasingly rapid demise, or do you think that the Muscovites in St. Petersburg, Russians, haven't quite been affected yet? So there's still a little bit of time that Putin's got to play safely.
Yeah. So having cut through the chatter, whether Putin wins on the chatter, is he winning on the multiple fronts of the war? And on that economic front, I'm always wary, Philip, of going hard with saying, oh, this is it, Russia's collapsed. On the other hand, Russia can stand, because you and I know we've been here 40 months. And we know that the big story here is that Russia's running a wartime economy. And when you run a wartime economy, despite sanctions, if you throw enough state funds into a wartime economy, and if people will buy into that, because some people do benefit from that. For example, all those folks from poor backgrounds who have just said, look, I'm going to risk my life on the front line in Ukraine, because I'm going to see more money than my family has seen in decades, right? Then you can keep that going for a while. But, if you cut through all those headlines you talked about, here's a fundamental I give you, which is where you read real signals versus chatter. And that is that last week at the major forum in St. Petersburg, the economy minister came out and said, look, the central bank has got to do something here. They've got to significantly drop interest rates, because we're heading for a recession. Now, the thing is the Kremlin's been bragging about the fact that they've kept growth rates going because of all the money that they've thrown into a militarized economy. Now, here's your economy minister saying that's not going to continue. The central bank, on the other hand, kicks back. They had dropped interest rates from 21 to 20%. That's all they're going to give. And their line is, look, we drop interest rates further, we're going to spike inflation, which is already at fairly high levels in there. Meanwhile, the sanctions are affecting certain sectors. I mean, they're definitely affecting the Russian aviation sector, because they cannot get enough parts to keep aircraft in good working order. They affect other parts of the manufacturing base, including the automotive industry. Now, ordinary citizens don't go out and buy an airplane or buy a car every few months. And the question is, does it affect, for example, food prices? And there is evidence that food prices are going up because there was also, I think, a poor harvest regarding potatoes, a staple of the Russian economy. There's been a significant spike there. So you get this unease that's taking place. Where do you read the signal on that? Well, you go back to Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin again makes his address. I think it may have been in St. Petersburg again at that forum. He said, "Oh, we're going to cut defense spending." You go, what? You're going to cut defense spending? Wait a minute, dude. You've got this historic increase. At least since World War II, definitely since the end of the Cold War, in which you've ramped up military spending for this invasion. Now you say suddenly you're going to be able to cut it. And what he's doing is he's dangling the idea before everybody, oh, well, when we win in Ukraine, I'm going to cut defense spending. That shows you Putin knows that everybody's not completely happy with this. Fact of this comes down to a fundamental which we cannot completely measure, especially because Russia is not an open society. And that is, my experience is that people in many countries will put up and indeed support their leaders when they go to war, even if they don't necessarily agree with the reasons for the war initially, even if they're not sure the war will work out, because they believe in their country, right? At what point does that belief in country erode to the point where it matches up with what Russians are having to sacrifice? And my answer to this, and I know it gets to be repetitive, is marathon, not a sprint. I think if I'm looking at it realistically, from my point of view, I'm probably looking at a stalled front line. I'm looking at Russia continuing with its attacks on Ukraine, but I'm looking at Ukraine hitting deep behind Russia And what I'm thinking here is we've got a window through 2025. And if this continues through 2025 and there's not much shift, then in 2026, I think you've got a real question as to whether both sides, Ukraine and Russia, can continue to fight this conflict from the economic and political standpoint.
Well, you talked about the Russian domestic economy there and the impact that this is having on it. But if we look at what Russia's relying on, its domestic economy is not keeping up with the defense output that it needs to continue to prosecute the war. So it's having to go out to Iran for technology transfer, North Korea for ammunition, and I've seen artillery pieces and rocket transfer, China for technology. But if Russia's economy is collapsing, it's not going to be able to pay for that. Now, it's going to be easier to pay North Korea because North Korea is desperate for money, but China is very economically driven. What do you think the concessions are that Putin will be given China to try and keep them on side, or at least continue supplying what they need to prosecute the war, if he can't do it in hard cash terms?
Yeah, let me get to China in just a second. A neat couple of immediate signals. First on that, again, I got to go short term versus long term, Philip. And again, you're going to know this, and that is, I think you're absolutely right that if you're talking about fighting a military campaign across a whole range of fronts with all the high tech equipment and so on, Russia faces strains in terms of certain places, right? And for example, I'd say the drone war, which is up there. And in terms of not just getting more drones out there, but in terms of the advanced technology that you need to make sure your drones are better than the other guys, that's something that you've got to watch there. In terms of the missiles, not as many missiles necessarily as they had in 22, 23, but they still got enough to lob. The point here, of course, is what Russia has is Russia's got a lot of men. They got and you just got to make sure those guys have got clothes on their backs and that they've got enough, ammunition and they got shells. And Russia starts off with a massive advantage over Ukrainian shells that even though that diminishes a bit, they still maintain that. But I think one interesting signal, both in terms of tactics and resources, and you will have seen this, Philip, is the increased number of Russian fighters who are on motorcycles. That they're putting them on motorcycles for mobility, but also because they don't necessarily have the type of heavier armored equipment. They don't have the type of heavier transport that you would need. So I partially agree with your point, but you can still prosecute this war for a while. And that raises the broader question of, but what does it take to keep it going? And our first signal is in North Korea this week, right? So Sergei Shoigu, the Russian former defense minister, secretary of the National State Security Council, goes out there twice for serious discussions with the North Koreans in terms of probably munitions, possibly North Korean missiles, possibly whether the North Koreans put more troops in. Because South Korean intelligence says they think North Korea may send more troops in by July. Now, North Korea sent 12,000 in, but that was to defend Russian territory or recapture Russian territory. The question here is, if additional North Koreans go in, does Putin cross a red line by putting them inside Ukraine, right? So that's something that you watch on North Korea. You also watch, though, the gala celebration they had with Kim Jong-un there, alongside the Russian culture minister, with all the bands and people cheering, hurrah, great leader, and so on. And you see for the first time Kim, giant photographs of Kim with the coffins of those North Koreans who've come back from Russia. So North Korea signals they're in it. Okay. Now, their equipment, their kit is not as good as Iranian kit, Chinese kit. Iran's on back foot right now. So they can supply drones, I think, still to the Russians, but they're a little bit more constrained. China is the big question here. And again, I think you have to come at this from a diplomatic standpoint, and you have to realize that the Chinese will not put their heads up. They're not going to put their heads up and declare how much they're supplying to the Russians. If they get busted for supplying stuff to the Russians, they're going to say, oh, this is coming through companies that are not connected with the state, right? And you do that, right? And I do think that watching brief where you call the Chinese out on this does limit how much they risk in giving support to the Russians. But the big thing that will condition Chinese support is the political situation. If Russia does not get a breakthrough on the front line, and if Ukraine continues to punish Russia, China doesn't back losers. And China doesn't back stalemates, right? There are Chinese talks going on with the EU this week. Those talks will be on economic, political, and military issues. And I'm not a big fan of the Chinese regime, especially on human rights issues. But I think here you maneuver the Chinese to continue to say to them, you've got far more important things here in terms of where you want to go with your economic development, in terms of where you want to go with your relationship with other countries within the international community. You don't want to be saddled by being alongside Vladimir Putin if this drags on and on and on.
Do you think, with the growing relationship that there is between Russia and North Korea over North Korea's support into Ukraine, we should be getting more and more concerned about an emboldened Kim Jong Un and what he then might take this greater status he'll feel he has with greater knowledge of military matters and everything else, and proof that his troops can fight as a further destabilizing factor in Southeast Asia and elsewhere?
In the longer run, I think that's a possibility, Philip, but not in the short run. And in the short run, I actually think this is a signal of North Korea's weakness. Why is North Korea throwing all in with the Russians? They're throwing all in with the Russians because they got precious few friends elsewhere to deal with here. You know, Donald Trump, he probably would fall in love again with Kim if he got another giant envelope, but he's off on another 5-6 missions trying to fall in love with different people around the world, whether it's Vlad one day, whether it's Xi Jinping, heaven help us, whether he ever decides he falls in love with Mark Carney and Canada becomes the 51st state, right? So Trump's not a reliable for North Korea. China's not a reliable for North Korea. China's not happy with them, et cetera. And so North Korea, a relatively isolated state, right? Okay, here's their way to break out of isolation, and they make links with Russia. But that comes at a big cost. You make friends with Russia, you're not going to win over the Chinese by doing that for reasons we can talk into. You're certainly not going to win over other countries in Asia. So, in the short term, no, this is North Korea trying to play like they're the big boys. Now, in the longer term, what are they getting in terms of assistance for their missile program? What are they getting in terms of their other delivery program, space program from the Russians? We don't know. At least I don't know. You might have better information than I do. But we just had references that it is believed this is what Russia is giving in advance. And I think, given that we don't know here, we keep it as an open question, but I will give you this. It's a really good PR line, and it's one that Zelensky's used, and it's one that others should use, which is, do you really want an emboldened North Korea? If you don't want an emboldened North Korea, maybe you should rethink being hesitant about supporting Ukraine against Russia.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's been a lot of subtle language around suggesting Russia might be considering or passing nuclear technology on to not necessarily North Korea, but Donald Trump talked to Putin about supplying capability to Iran when he used the line, don't ensure that Iran gets any weapons that could destroy Israel. But looking at Russia's targeting inside Ukraine, Russia's got sophisticated weapon systems. However, we're seeing more and more targeting against civilian targets. Russia's still trying to do the old tactic of breaking the Ukrainian civilian morale. Do you think Putin's getting it wrong, attacking purely civilian targets inside Ukraine?
This is just what Putin knows. I mean, this goes all the way back to February 2022. The whole idea is, okay, right, Russia's going to overwhelm Ukraine within a few weeks was based upon the fact, not necessarily that you would have like a complete military defeat, but that the civilians would completely, either because they love Russia or because they saw their government couldn't defend them, they were going to rise up and back the Russian victory. That didn't happen, right? It didn't happen in northern Ukraine when the Russians were forced to withdraw in April 22. It didn't happen with the counteroffensive when Ukrainians celebrated the liberation of parts of the east and parts of the south, right? So it hasn't happened, but this is the whole, and I don't think it's just Putin. I think this is just simply, as it were, this is the Russian way of fighting the war, which is you fight this war across the military and civilian fronts with the idea that, at some point they'll just break. I mean, you think the Russians would have learned from World War II in their own experience that it don't happen that way, that given that they had been hit by Germany for years, they didn't break. You think they would learn that? But you also have something which is, and Putin repeated it last week, the whole of Ukraine is Russian. The whole of Ukraine is Russian. And you think, okay, is that just a PR line? And in part, it's a PR line, which is if you don't give us the 4 regions that we're asking for in the east and the south, we're going to demand 2 more in the northeast, Sumy and Kharkiv. In part, it's a PR line. But in part, I think with leaders, you have to sometimes like, this is what they genuinely believe. They genuinely believe this. And it may not be something they even start off believing, but after years of running the propaganda, they kind of absorb all of this. And I'm still struck, Philip, as you've seen it. You go back to that July 2021 long screed where Putin signaled he was going to invade, if you look at it, and where he just writes this diatribe about there is no such thing as Ukrainian nation. There's no Ukrainian nation. There's no Ukrainian identity, which is a national identity. They just have a Russian identity. And you look at every statement of Sergei Lavrov, who I think doesn't believe it, but who plays upon it to say that the real problem is that Russians are persecuted in Ukraine, which about 25 points of rebuttal I could point there to put to that. But I'll just simply say at this point, it's hogwash, but it's part of that narrative that the Russians within Ukraine want to be liberated and Ukrainians want to be liberated. And all I can put it to you is that we know it doesn't play out that way, but we know that the Russians won't stop because they're not winning. That's the point. If the Russians were winning on the battlefield in the east, they wouldn't be hitting the civilian areas elsewhere so hard. And I'm gonna put it, because we get a lot of great YouTube comments out there, Philip, and you and I get a lot of love from some folks who say, "But wait a minute, Russia's winning." Name the cities and towns that Russia has taken, not just this year, but since 2023. Name the cities and towns that they've taken. We could talk about Bakhmut back in May of 23 in the east in Donetsk. We could talk about Avdiivka back in early 2024 that we could talk about. The one further to the south, there's another one, the one that begins with V. And now everybody on YouTube is going to get me, right? A couple of other towns in Donetsk that they've taken. They still haven't taken Pokrovsk.
And the towns are all piles of rubble. And you mentioned earlier you're surprised the Russians hadn't learned the lessons from the Second World War. Well, any government and any military I've never seen learn lessons and implement them. They seem to re-identify the same lessons over and over again. But that gives us a perfect excuse to talk about this more and more. Scott, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline.
Philip, it's been great. The town I couldn't remember is Vuhledar in Donetsk. Covered myself against the trolls. So hi to the trolls, but more importantly, hi to all the great viewers and listeners of Times Radio out there. See you again soon.
And we'll make sure Vuhledar stays in, because I was trying to rack my brains for it as well and couldn't remember.
There you go. Much appreciated, Philip. Stay safe, stay sane.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.